Hello and welcome to Dance Takes. This is our May episode. I'm Rachel from Dance Dialogues, and for this episode we're joined by Sarah Lapinsky on behalf of Dance Art Journal.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's lovely to have you, Sarah. So we're going to be talking about some works that we saw together, also one that I saw myself. And the idea of this platform is just to offer a more informal, conversational way of talking about dance. So yeah, we're going to get started. And the first work we're going to talk about is the first one we saw together in May, actually, which was Ballet BC, presented by Dance Consortium at Sadler's Wells. And yeah, it had works by Crystal Pite and Johan Inger. So yeah, should we get into that, Sarah?
Yeah, we'll start with Crystal Pite's piece, Frontier. That was originally made in 2008, restaged for Ballet BC to be shown. I think they restaged it in 2024. I think that piece was talking about kind of unconscious, unknown, kind of had these themes of shadows and darkness and light within that, which came out pretty clearly in the dancers were wearing, some were wearing white clothing, some were wearing full, like, shadowed, all faces covered, all bodies covered up in that way as well.
Yeah, so I really liked that aspect of it, this play between like shadow and light, which obviously, as you said, was a very visual reference in the costumes, but there was also like this hint in it for me of these shadowed figures being something of like the unconscious or an inner voice or an inner dialogue. And they kind of played with that, I think, in the duets, some of the duets that they showed, and in the way the characters kind of disappeared or re-entered, and these entrances and exits.
Yeah, it's like sometimes they were kind of there but not there. Like the piece started with them kind of rolling from the pit onto the stage, which I think was also how they ended the piece as well. And then when they were interacting, it would be a duet, and they would kind of be very supportive of the person who was wearing the white costume. And you noted something about how the sound. There were some sound effects. They used some classical songs as well, but they had sound effects and also some kind of like whispers.
Yeah, there was a really interesting thing in this work with the audio. And in terms of the use of text, like some of it was audible occasionally, but most of it you couldn't actually make out the words. And I thought that was quite an interesting dynamic to choose to include text when you can't actually understand what that text is saying. But I think it added to this layer of these, maybe potentially these shadowy figures being something of the unconscious, being these thoughts that are kind of present or just there on the outskirts, having some kind of influence on those dancers in white. But it never really became like concrete or apparent. So it's kind of left to this kind of shadowy world to, is it this, is it that? Which gave that kind of interesting dynamic element to that piece,
I think so, yeah. And also she has such a theatrical way of working. Now, I wouldn't say this piece is, along her kind of Beethoven height, like full dance theater like she does with her own company. This really speaks to 2008, that vocabulary of the contemporary ballet, really classical, but also having these contemporary influences that at the time was very, I think, revolutionary. And now 20 years on almost, it seems kind of
20 years.
20 years,
really?
I know.
Not far off, yeah.
Yeah, it seems very different now to see it. It was still very beautiful, and in their socks just gliding all the way across the stage. And also just seeing 25 dancers on stage at the same time is not something you really get to see with those images and the visuals,
Yeah, I think there's something in that, just that amount of bodies on stage that you can really play with, what you can create visually and the atmosphere that you can create. And yeah, like you said, it had that really fluid quality of her choreography, which I think has become something that you kind of just used to watching now.
Yeah.
And you kind of think, actually, back in 2008, that was really, something a bit more edgy or different to see.
It was something so new. And it was really interesting to kind of revisit that. And then with the imagery as well, she does use those aspects of staging where there were curtains, I think, around the stage, so the dancers are dividing the space, but then these curtains are as well, and then they start to fall, which really kind of almost like an impermanence of the space, and all the use of lighting where it has this kind of flashlight sort of things, very kind of low lighting at some points to really focus your eye, I think was very strong.
Yeah, and I think actually also, like you're saying about the curtains falling, when they disappeared, it's like the space became a lot more barren. I don't know if that's something that reflects the frontier of the title, but it just gave an almost very different quality to the space that we were seeing on stage, and maybe to the intention of the figures that were there and not there.
Yeah, and as the piece developed, it kind of, the characters that were in white kind of, I think they joined as shadows, but then one might have come back at the end. It was all very kind of questioning, like the frontier. It's really not known, and I think it was nice how it presented that, presented the questions, and gave us an opportunity to engage with them.
Yeah, and find your own answers rather than prescribing something within like a world that was really just quite beautiful to watch. And shall we move on to the second piece of the double bill, which was Passing by Johan Inger?
Yes.
I'm going to read what they put in the program for this because I think it sums it up quite nicely. Because it says, Passing, in the unstoppable flow of birth, aging, and death, Passing seeks the fragile moments when the sensitive, vulnerable, and intimate aspects that make every individual trajectory unique dissolve and the group emerges. I just thought I'd say that because it sums it up better than I probably can.
Yeah, it was a really interesting play between kind of individual and group, and you really saw a lot of relationships. It was really palpable. The piece had a lot of kind of abstract imagery. I remember it opening with, I think, two characters from opposite sides spreading, I think it was kind of a black sand, maybe ashes kind of thing around the stage. And that does come back later when someone's sweeping it up, and at the end it kind of all falls, So it introduces that abstract, theatrical bit, but then at the same time, the dancers were so human in a really nice kind of refreshing way to say, because also in Crystal Pites they were very inhuman.
Yeah, that's true. Very like figurative bodies, whereas this is definitely seeing humans on stage, people living their lives, going through that life cycle.
Talk about our potential favorite part.
Potential favorite part. I love this bit. But also, I found it really interesting when you when we were talking just before recording, when you said about the black sand that they were spread on the stage, because I'd totally forgotten that part. And I think it's quite interesting that I really remembered the human, like the majority of the piece, the middle section, I guess you'd call it.
It's hard to put it into sections.
Yeah,
it is really passing through, like the pacing of the piece. It's kind of overlapping, almost overwhelming ideas at some point. So it's hard to talk about.
But I think like that opening and the closing were in those almost abstract realms of consciousness, like the start of life, the end of life, these different planes that you maybe come from or pass out of or into. And then it went into the very human qualities. So the choreography had this really lovely element that, whilst it was sort of abstracted movement, it had the kind of human awkwardness about it, had a bit of quirkiness. And this really came across in some of the images and scenes that they created. And one particular one, which I think was the first like striking image, was, I guess, a sex scene, a moment of orgasm, which preceded a moment of birth. So sequentially that kind of needed to be there to really make sense.
And I'm really glad that they included that, because I feel like a lot of times that will get glossed over when we talk about birth, when we talk about love, when we talk about life. It's where it comes from, and I'm glad that this piece chose to include it. And I think the way they did it really set up the birthing scene that happened,
which was completely surreal, but made sense in the context of that. And I think what I really liked about this was that so often when you're like, oh, okay, this is going to be a performance of a moment of sex or human physicality in that way on stage, or human intimacy, and you're like, oh, I don't know how to put this across in a performative way. Sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too literal. Whereas this one, like, just totally went with like an awkwardness of it.
It was quite playful.
It was really funny. It was really playful.
Just so to say, she's So it was a man and a woman.
A man and a woman, yeah.
And she was lying on the stage, and he kind of stomps around her in a circle, and she kind of writhes, and then it goes black, and you hear her making orgasmic sounds.
Yeah.
And
I think it was like the rhythms of it, and his
Yeah.
little run that he did that just
I
felt
think he
like
might have gotten
quite
faster
weird.
as well.
Yeah, and it was just like the way they played with it was really quite funny, and it made the audience laugh. I think
Well,
it
first
took
it
away.
felt really awkward because I remember watching it, and it's you just everyone's kind of like, wait, is what I think happening is happening? Yes, it is. And then once that laughter kind of broke, it felt much calmer and it felt more fun. And
it just felt like, even though it was abstracted, it felt more real in that sense.
Yeah.
And then we got to Sarah's favorite bit, which was birthing.
The birthing. So they had the couple. She's at the corner in that lower stage, and you can't see what's coming out. And then I think 12.
Is this a spoiler alert?
This is a spoiler alert. I'm so sorry. Spoiler alert.
If you don't want to
but I think like 12 dancers crawl underneath her legs, and she screams like she's giving birth every time. And the audience was honestly hysterical. It was wonderful to hear the audience laugh. I was laughing so hard. And, then they kind of develop from baby, like crawling to walking. But like that moment was just so funny.
And I think it was kind of, what's the word? Typical, not typical, but significant of this piece, these kind of moments where it doesn't go the literal, it takes it into sort of this other realm, but you know exactly what's going on, you know exactly what's being said.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to recognize those things.
Yeah, and I really love that they've used dance in that way.
Yeah.
To say something in a different kind of realm with the body, but to make it really clear at the same time.
Yeah, and they were doing really virtuosic things with their body, but then to also include laughing and crying, which is your face, and we that's part of our movement. But I feel like much dance, we kind of will take that out, but to really incorporate that as a choreographic tool.
Yeah, this piece definitely played with relationships, as we talked about, but human emotion, and I guess really at its heart it's about people connecting through relationships or through a community, and the face of that across this life journey. And the laughter, the crying, the humour, the absurdity, the surprises all go with that. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And then these little moments, those surprises, like we said, that keep popping up, like the tap dancer.
Yeah, tap dancing on 4 legs or something. I don't know, running across the stage really randomly, doing something quite slow and poetic. And you don't know.
Yeah, it's like these moments that just break something. And that's what I really enjoyed. For me, I enjoyed the timing of the piece where they chose to like break a moment. Maybe it was something poetic and then something just cuts through that. I think for you, maybe had a slightly different experience of the timing of the piece. Or...
Yeah, I mean, I was watching it. At one point, I did think, I was like, gosh, this was something that I could have watched for longer, and then something else was very long. But I think I wrote that down, and then immediately later, I was like, nope, I changed my mind. But it did really require me to kind of stay with it in the sense of like, honestly kind of experiencing the loss of the image that I liked, and then getting used to whatever was coming next, really accepting it, and not having, a say in what's happening, which was
comment
mirroring life.
I was going to say, it's like a comment on life itself, a little life mirror.
So meta.
Was there anything else you wanted to like mention about that work? Anything that stuck with you?
I think the ending was interesting. We didn't talk about that yet. Because they were super, characterized and very, individualistic within their community the whole time. And it was interesting when at the end, they took off the, colorful characterizing clothing they had to just their nude under things, and kind of lost that. And then I think it was a real interesting kind of dissolution to just the body and that kind of loss, which I think was an interesting way I felt that loss. I felt the loss of their individuality approaching the end of the piece, I guess the end of our lives. It was very poetic, and it was a very big shift for me. And then having that sand kind of, or ashes kind of call from the ceiling really kind of solidified that, I think.
Yeah, that shift from the very human and the fun qualities and the awkwardness and the humour to the poeticness, back to that abstract realm that they kind of started in.
And how they all ended in the same kind of way, which is interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as a work, actually. Yeah. And I think as a double bill, it felt quite a strong evening of performance that had similarities, but also two quite different pieces that almost kind of exist within the same realm in some ways.
Yeah, a nice dialogue between them.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And shall we chat about our next piece?
Yes.
I think the next one I saw was one I saw myself, and that was The Heat by Becky Namgauds. Okay, so this piece, The Heat by Becky Namgauds, is set within a domestic space, and I think it's playing with disrupting the expectations of that space of a place of comfort or, certain mundane tasks that happen within it. And there's this group of women. They're very much 5 individual women, but what's really nice in this work is how she kind of seems to find a balance between these women have their very individual characters and seem to have their individual worlds, but they're all existing in the same space, and you're not quite sure whether they are aware of each other or not. Even though they have moments of interaction, it's like, are they together or are they just entirely separate, living their own lives? And it's a really interesting piece that finds, I think, looks for like freedom and liberation in these everyday, mundane domestic tasks. Like there's bits of hoovering, there's a sofa, there's a lamp, and all these little elements. But then there's also very much moments of absurdity and surrealism, like some of the images she plays with. There's one moment that it's kind of a disembodied head and people come out the backs of the sofa, and it has these really, it's very strong physicality throughout. But yeah, moves between, I would say, like a series of images, and that's what feels the strength in this piece, the scenes that she develops and plays with. And I think that was something that came across in the post-show tour, that they had throughout their creative process a lot of scenes that they used, and only some of them obviously get to be in the show. So we kind of get this impression of like glimpses into a world, and maybe there's still things that exist outside of that. But throughout it, I think what's really strong is, how she's finding like the power in these women, that they're very much like, they're feminine, but not in like that whimsical feminine way. It's in like the strong, powerful female way. And one of the things I think that Becky had said inspired this work was a collection of paintings by Paula Rego called Dog Woman, where the woman has this kind of more animal quality. And I think that comes across through her movement as definitely a primal element, maybe with like the crawling and the way that the women move in this piece. I think that was some of the things that stood out for me in it.
Were there any sections that you thought were, particularly strong, or, images that like really stayed with you?
I feel like this is a leading question and relates back, for sure. So a little connection back to the Johan Inger piece we were talking about. So again, in Becky's piece, there's an orgasm scene. And again, this is one of the bits that really sticks with you in this piece. As well as the headless woman that I mentioned before, that's quite a comical moment in the work that keeps like popping in and reappearing, and physically quite clever in the way that that illusion is played with. But going back to the orgasm, so I feel like with this moment, it is one of the maybe clearest moments of liberation for the women on the stage, and also a moment that gets pushed and pushed. Like it goes on for a long time. And I think that continues, and then it continues more, and that kind of leans into this like ridiculousness, realm of ridiculousness. That's quite a hard word to say. Becomes more surreal, and it's just funny because it starts, I think, with one woman, and she has this vibrator out on the table, dildo vibrator with its light flashing away, and it's almost like the rhythm of this vibrating on the table is what kind of begins this rhythm of the orgasms and the breath that the women are playing with. And it's very visceral, it's very physical, it's like the body shaking, there's breath, and I feel like it just gets pushed, and each woman pushes it until it becomes just like quite ridiculous in what they're doing. There's like a plant, there's water being sprayed, there's pants being wrung out. It goes up into a whole realm, and it's really funny. But it's also like something very freeing in it, that it becomes, right, this is these women owning this space, owning their physicality, owning their desire. And I think that's something that was one of the really strong moments in this work. And yeah, I think also that it really kind of breaks this world of domesticity. I can't say words today. Is that the right word?
Yeah, domesticity.
Yeah. And it kind of moves through that space and stays in that space until the end, when it enters a whole different world. And this is a very low light, and they're naked. And it feels like it's almost a whole different realm from the scene that we've existed in up till then. And in some ways it feels like it's part of a different piece. And in some ways it feels like maybe actually it's just a space where they've transcended to this other space where maybe they're the full versions of themselves, where they're just in their power as women. But I guess, with dance, you get left open to interpretation in that way. And I think what I enjoyed most about it was just seeing these individual characters of these women being given the space to play with that character, to develop it, and to each have their individuality, even though existing within kind of one company of women on the stage.
Sounds really cool.
It was quite fun. And kind of, I guess, like bold in its physicality as well. So it was great to see that piece. And that was shown at Sadler's Wells at Lillian Baylis, so it also had that kind of intimacy of that smaller theatre. And you kind of got that intimacy of being close to those women using their physicality in that way. And it was nice to see that played with.
Do you feel like you were in that space with them, in that kind of, domestic space that you described, and then, or did it feel quite separate? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it felt like you were there with them, but also you were kind of observing the scene. Like, as domestic as it also felt quite surreal in a lot of ways. I think sometimes the absurdity of some of the things that happened, some of the trajectories that the scenes went on, it did feel in some ways like you were, observing these women, these primal beings, like taking up that space. But at the same time, there was an intimacy of just being there and being present with it. So kind of a balance, maybe somewhere between the two for me. Yeah.
Nice.
Great. And shall we talk about the final piece, the one that we saw together? And this was a piece we saw at the Place, part of the Shabak Festival, and it was called The Love Behind My Eyes by a choreographer, Ali Chahrour. And this was a piece with many powerful moments for me.
Yeah, it was very image-based, but, like, very different from the others that we've seen in this month. It was very slow-paced. It was, quite low lighting, which really did some interesting things to the body, and as the piece kind of developed, it really, changed how we viewed what was happening, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like, maybe to give a little context to it, it tells the story of, or it's based on the story of a son of a religious man who fell in love with another man, and as he couldn't live his passion, he died of a broken heart. But
Mm.
I think it's based around a collection of poetry and poems that were written for his lover. So that's the angle of love that this piece is working from,
Yes, the loss of love.
the loss of love,
Yeah.
of grief, and that feels very, yeah, very striking, I think, in the images that are there. They're very tender. There's a lot around touch and the sensitivity of that, but this tenderness also has a lot of pain and sometimes aggression and violence in it, I think.
Yeah, they connect very gently, but they're also, very uncomfortable places, and it's very durational, the way they hold these things,
Yeah.
and some repetition that happens where, I could feel my back starting to hurt when there's this back bend, and it's that support, but also, being held in that uncomfortable position. It's a very interesting perspective on the relationship and the way it developed of, you know, towards the ending of it as well, that loss and the pain that comes through in that.
Yeah, and I think this is quite a striking figure within this piece. So there's the two men who are um, like this, creating these very physical, body-based images, and then there's a third figure, which is a woman called Layla, who we found out in the post-show talk was a professional mourner. Um, and yeah, she's quite a significant figure in this work.
Yeah, she sings. I think it's the same song. I think it does change. But she sings a song that really contains the space throughout, a very strong voice, and very durational for her as well. And she also serves as kind of the witness to the relationship, and also potentially, you can add so much to it. Is she the mother? Is she, how does she relate to them?
Yeah, I feel like as a figure within this piece, yeah, whether it's mother or sister or witness, she very much holds the space of this work in that role. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting that it's a woman who is holding the space, who is holding the grief, who is holding the loss, who is
Mhm.
supporting the love, who is kind of just there as witness to, yeah, to the love and the sorrow and to the pain. And she's just quite powerful in her presence there for me.
Yeah, even, and it was interesting because I remember at the beginning, she's in the first, wing, and she's holding the wings, I think, and she's kind of pulled back away from the space, and then enters the space, and she exits into the audience, which I felt very interesting when she kind of joined us. If we had been in the front row, she would have just sat next to us, which was interesting how she kind of also connected us very much to their space, um, in a really transitional kind of way.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot about those elements. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's such a poignant figure in it, I think,
Yeah.
and in somehow carrying this, yeah, very, I don't know, very slow but quite striking work and the images that we see in it. Like it's a piece that kind of leaves an impression on you, I think, like visual impressions, images that stay with you,
Yeah.
even though actually it's quite minimal in what happens.
Yeah, it felt very, affecting in the way that I felt very present with them, where it was images, but they lasted so long, but also had all these subtle shifts through it, very kind of constantly transforming that. Talking about it now, it's difficult to kind of think back and say, "Oh, this happened in the middle," or "This happened," because it was so, present in that development, and I was with them in that, and it
Yeah,
kind of
just like
stays with
very
you.
gently transform, gently shift. And it's almost like a suspended moment of time, isn't it? In that
Very much
work.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. Just all kind of in that with the touch, which I think was interesting as well, because in the post-show talk, they talked about how, this was created during the pandemic, which I think also adds kind of a layer to the approach to touch because it wasn't, allowed during that time, and how that space also became very, what was the word they used for the rehearsal space?
I think a space of like no boundaries. Like I wrote down something they said about in the rehearsal room we have no boundaries. There's just a need for a specific moment without care of the world outside. Like, it's a space where we can create our own rules.
Yeah.
And I think that was quite poignant because of obviously the connection of touch within the pandemic time, but also I think the political and cultural climate in which this work has been created. The choreographers are working in Beirut, and I think it's come out of a place of crisis and of conflict and of love and loss, and that feels really present, like throughout kind of the very bones of the work, really.
Yeah. And then just some of the images that stuck with me at the very beginning. There was that low lighting, and one of the performers, I think, was on some kind of rolling thing and just very gently rolled forward in a way that didn't look like anyone was pushing it. Kind of freaked me out a bit. But his body was so contorted and the light only caught bits of it that it was a question of, is that a body? And then who is it? And then when he started to move, it became really, oh wow, that he was there that kind of whole time.
Yeah, I guess there's that interplay, especially with the very low lighting, of it being very human and then it being like a body that is loved, but also a body that is a body in death. There was like the image of the shroud, and obviously Layla there as a professional mourner. That interplay was always kind of very present, I think, in the images and in the way they played with what could be seen in the body and how those bodies were presented to you.
Yeah, and in that death scene, the light from, I think, the first wing rolled closer to the performer who was passing away, and then I think rolled over them as well, while they were being covered by that shroud. And it really, those layers, those levels, and everything was in the first two wings, I think. It was all very close to us.
It did feel, actually, yeah.
Which was very interesting, because it was, maybe we're almost touching them in a sense. Like,
yeah,
I don't know, I felt very close in this like very intimate kind of thing to be witnessing.
And I think that played with the idea of how comfortable you feel witnessing these things as well, because I guess we were also all witnesses to that scene, the scenes unfolding, and like part of it. But yeah, it's like kind of pushing the boundaries, probably with the slowness, but also with, I think, what the subjects they're tackling, and trying to give a voice and a space to on stage. Yeah. So, anything else you wanted to mention about that piece before we round up our reviews of Dance for Me?
No, I don't think so. It was really wonderful to hear the post-show talk. I will say that was probably one of the most well-attended post-show talks I've ever seen, with some really great questions, and it was really wonderful to have that insight into the piece as well, when it was so minimal, to really be able to have more insight into the process really helped me, especially I think potentially just after the piece, just manage kind of what was affecting me,
to give some time to like kind of process it through as well. And there were some really interesting things about censorship that came up, and the different types of censorship, of what they experience culturally, like you can include and you can't include, but then what he's found bringing this piece to Europe and kind of suggesting there's a different kind of censorship into how works are presented, and that was quite an interesting thing to hear.
Yeah, it was like what, in where they're from, they censor what you can say and what you. Don't know if it was what you can think, but it was something like that.
I think it's like what text can be included, like subjects you can talk about, and he was saying there's a bit more freedom in dance.
Yeah,
because they don't always think about like. So he can actually say more in dance than maybe he could if he was creating a theatre piece.
And then it was the coming here where the constrictions of how you can actually present your work, what resources you have available to you, which I think is interesting, because we've had conversations about that ourselves, of the resources and what we experience as artists in this country, and to have someone else come and see that was very eye-opening, I think.
Yeah, it's quite a provocation, I found. And kind of just like that whole talk added, I think, to the strength of the work, and to kind of giving an insight into really what was behind that staging and behind such a piece that felt so held, but so like slow and, like you said, durational. But you could tell it had just so many layers and so much complexity within it. And it's quite beautiful to see a room full of people there to like learn more about it and to hear what the choreographers like had to say about their work. But I think that rounds up actually our shows that we've seen throughout May. It's been really nice to go and watch some more work with you, and also to see quite a range of work again. But some really strong pieces this month, and looking forward to doing some more through June. And thank you, Sarah, for coming to join Dance Takes.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
Lovely to have you.